All right. Tonight's lesson takes us back to the Old Testament, to a book by the name of Exodus. And of course, Exodus is the book that was written to describe not only the departure from Egypt by God's people, the descendants of Abraham, who God had promised to make a great nation. But it's also the book that details for us the actual giving of the law. And we know that Moses, after a couple of 40-year periods, is finally ready, kind of trained by God to actually go to the land and to bring those people out. And hesitantly, he does so, and he goes down to the land of Egypt, and he stands before Pharaoh and just boldly proclaims, "Let my people go." And of course, there's a whole bunch of bad things that take place from that one simple statement. Pharaoh doesn't want to let the people go. Then they try to strike some compromises. Eventually, there are these plagues that are brought upon the land by the failure of Pharaoh to actually meet God's will. The final plague, of course, being that death of the firstborn of every child or of every home. And of course, that feast that the Jews would celebrate year after year called the Passover would commemorate that period of time. They leave Egypt, they get to the Red Sea, they cross through the Red Sea on dry ground, and they end up in a place called Sinai. And it's on top of Mount Sinai that God is going to deliver his law to the people. And we have that detailed for us in Exodus chapter 20 and the preceding chapters. But in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, God proclaims this to Moses. He says, "You shall not make for yourselves a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." Now, most of us are familiar with this particular passage, and hopefully we remember some part of the study that we did just last year about the Ten Commandments and the depth that we are given in those commandments that spans even into the generation that we now live in. It is just as wrong today for us to have these idolatrous things in our hearts. Now, tonight, we kind of want to steer this conversation in a little different direction. And we're not going to really talk about idols per se, but we are going to talk about things that idols do, particularly one thing that an idol will do. Someone once put it this way: when we accumulate anything on the table of our heart and mind that occupies our time and attention in a worshipful way, then we have created an idol. So when the space of your heart is occupied overtly and overly with one particular thing that is not God, then we have created an idol in our heart. But we want to take it just a little step further. And we want to mention this one simple point, or ponder this one simple point, that I think God is driving at when he gives this command in Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5. And that is that there are things in our life from time to time that not only do we make idols, but those idols interfere with true worship that will be offered to God. Now we go over to the New Testament and we find Jesus in John chapter 4 having a conversation with the woman at the well. Everybody remember that? The woman at the well, she's there, and of course it's very enlightening for her. She sees this guy as a stranger and who is a Jew, and she's perplexed that this Jew would ask her, a Samaritan, to get a drink of water for him. You know, they didn't interact that much, but they begin to have this conversation, and he is no longer the stranger. By the time the conversation is done, he is not only a prophet, but he is the Messiah. And she comes to know him through that conversation in fairly quick order. But as part of that conversation, you may recall they talk about worship. And Jesus points out something to her. If you turn over there in John chapter 4, right around verse 22, we're going to read just a little bit. John chapter 4, beginning with verse 22. he looks at the woman, and of course she's a Samaritan, so they are considered a half-breed people. And part of the reason they were considered a half-breed people is because they took parts of the law, created their own system of religion, but it was only partial. It didn't include the whole of the ceremonial or the other parts of the law that God had given to his chosen people. They had Mount Gerizim as a place of worship, as opposed to Jerusalem, which would be established later as the place of worship for the Jews and on into the day of Christ. So he looks at her and says, "You worship you do not know. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is now here, when the true worshipers will worship with the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." When we place idols in our heart, in other words, and let's put it down in more practical terms, when we allow something that exists in this world to become a distraction from us worshiping God, okay, then we sometimes say we've created an idol. But I think we have it kind of backwards. When we allow this distraction or something in this world to become our idol, it actually interferes with our worship. We don't give God our best. We don't necessarily seek truth. And certainly doing it in a fervent or spirited, passionate way is kind of far from us. Well, why? Well, because our attention is drawn somewhere else. If my heart is divided between, my money and God, then typically what you'll see manifest is kind of a half-hearted approach to at least one or the other. I'm so into sports. Oh, it's Sunday. Man, I gotta go worship God, but I'm looking at my watch the whole time because I know kickoff's in an hour or whatever it is, and I've just got to be there because, heaven forbid, I miss the opening play. And there are plenty of people who are like that. For other people, it's money. For some people, it's cars. For other people, it's just kind of stuff. I mean, we live in an age where, hoarding has become a real problem. You ask folks why, and they don't really have an answer. It's just about stuff. And it's just about having stuff. And, sometimes it's a psychological thing, and it's a little bit different. But it's still kind of an idol. So tonight we want to talk about some common things that interfere with our true, genuine, spirited, and truthful worship offered to God. And the Bible details some of these things. And we're going to talk about them just a little bit. Just a little bit. Number one, and this is probably the one that most people don't really think of, but it's one that nonetheless is there, and oftentimes is a very, very difficult thing. And because it's very difficult, we're not willing to readily identify it. But our families can become an idol that prevent us from worship. I mean, after all, when people do or don't go to worship, or choose to or not to come to worship, and they are in a family setting, it is typically the influence of family that will bring one or the other. If you have everybody else in the family saying, "Man, can't wait to get to worship, going to practice some songs on the way, let's make sure we do our Bible reading the night before," then what are the odds that you're going to want to go to worship? You're going to want to get involved. You're going to want to read that passage and be spirited about worship. Well, better, if not great. But imagine it the other way. Imagine that, you're the one that wants to go to worship, but all of the other people in the house are like, I'm just kind of thinking about sleeping in this Sunday. I mean, God really doesn't mind if we miss too much. There's always Sunday night, but of course Sunday night rolls around and we've already, we're having a picnic and we've got the stuff all out and the watermelon's cut. or whatever it might be. We can't do it then, and then the next thing you know, it's been 2 or 3 years and you haven't come back to the church. Now, that may sound like a far-fetched thing, but over and over, if you look around, you see it happens all the time. People are influenced by their families. People are influenced by the people that are around them. Do not be unequally yoked to unbelievers. And sometimes we look at that passage and we think, well, we shouldn't align ourselves with people who are non-Christians. Well, maybe, and certainly so. Christian versus non-Christian. Can you say believer versus non-believer? Yeah, but what about the person who says they're a Christian and who at one point was on fire for the Lord and yet has now become milquetoast about the whole thing? Their love has grown cold, and they no longer are really into it. I mean, do we yoke ourselves to them, and that's okay? Even if they're family members? Well, certainly not. That's not okay, either. That's not okay either. Paul says don't be unequally yoked. What he means there is hook yourself to people who are going to move you forward. He's talking about oxen being in what do they call it? The yoke. And the reason you put oxen in a yoke was to what? Plow a field, right? Or to pull a load. And if it's unequally yoked, what do you think your furrow in the field is going to look like? Well, it's not going to look very good. It's probably not going to be straight. The load that you're carrying is probably going to always tend to the left or whatever side the weaker, animal's on. So there's always going to be that pull that is against you. Or, to put it another way, there's always going to be that pull to do those things that are not right or lead you in a direction that you shouldn't be going. And of all the people in the world to influence you, family is in the best position to do that. So it's possible that our family can be such a pull on us that we actually end up putting them before God. A lot of people have this saying, and I've heard it recently from a couple of individuals, and when you hear it, it sounds really, really good. Really good. Family first, right? Good thing or bad thing? And I know what they mean. Family first, meaning of all the things in this world, family should come first. And hopefully, they're assuming that actually God's first. Hopefully that's their assumption, and they're just knowing that it doesn't need to be said. It's like the Bible when the bestsellers list, New York Times bestsellers list. They don't even list it anymore, because it's always the number one selling book. So they just quit listing it. They quit listing it because it was always number one. Always number one. So they just assume it. Okay? So hopefully when these people say, family first, what they mean is, family, after God is first. Hopefully that's what they mean. But sometimes that's not what they mean. I personally know families where, the children dictate what goes on spiritually. I actually had one, couple and hadn't come to a congregation where we were working for a while, and I went to him and I was talking to him and I said, hey, I haven't seen you guys in a while. Well, the kids, they sometimes just don't like it, and there's not many in their age group, and we decided that we were going to go over here and try this, but the kids didn't like this, so we just decided for the kids' sake that we would stay home. And I'm thinking, since when have you put the spiritual priority of your household in the hands of those are least likely to steer it in the right direction? If that were the case in any other realm, would it make sense? Does the 12-year-old in your house do the finances? Does the 10-year-old in your home do the taxes? Does the 5-year-old in your house teach everybody else how to drive? That would be ridiculous. So why do we put our spiritual hope, our hope in eternal things, in the hands of the youngest? And I'm not picking on them at all. Teens are teens. Tweens are tweens. Kids are kids, right? And they think on the level that they can think, and they need to be encouraged and strengthened, but they don't have what you might call wisdom. And they need to be guided. But there are lots of families that's what they do. It's not just parents influencing kids. Sometimes it's the parents letting the kids lead the cart. Number two, money and possessions. This is the biggest one, and this is the biggest one that Christ dealt with in his day and age. We've said it before, and I just kind of mentioned it again tonight. Christ talked more about what to do with your money to get into eternity than he did about some other very important topics. And he doesn't mention baptism a whole lot, but he mentions money a whole lot. Money and, of course, sexual conduct are primary. And I think it's mainly because Christ knew that these were going to be big challenges, for him, or for humanity. Okay? So he mentions it a lot. He tells us that don't lay up your treasure here on earth. And he even says, look, the moth is going to break in and destroy it, and it's going to rust, and people might come in and steal it, and, all of those things will happen. It's not about the stuff, but instead, lay up your treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, right, there will your heart be also. That's where you put your treasure. Put your treasure in eternity. But what does that mean? What does it mean to put your treasure in eternity? Well, it means focus on spiritual things. Focus on spiritual activities that pay spiritual dividends. Talk to people about spiritual things. Make converts to Christianity. Help build people up. Establish, build, grow churches and people who will believe and join you there in heaven. Stuff passes away. I think I've mentioned it before. Most of us in the course of our lifetime, some probably more than others, if you're my wife, hers is exactly double mine, have had more than one cell phone, right? Let's throw in all phones, starting with, the rotary. I mean, we had rotary phones when I was really, really young. You do the dial and you have to wait for it to turn around, and then push-button phones, and then I remember when cordless phones came. Man, that was a big deal. When we had cordless phones, and then all of a sudden cell phones, and then now we got smartphones. Many, many phones. We could probably fill a few boxes with those, just stuff. At the time we were looking at it, we're thinking, man, this is the best. I don't think that we can make anything better than this. I mean, I don't have to have a cord. I can walk around the house. Now we got smartphones, and we can do this and bank and buy stuff and do whatever. Right there from one single device. I can sit and write a sermon on my phone and be ordering something from Amazon at the same time while emailing, twittering, and Facebooking somebody. All at the same time. It's an amazing thing, and we think to ourselves, what? We think to ourselves, could it get any better than that? But it'll pass away. And that phone that people pay $600, $700 for today will be on the scrap heap tomorrow. It's just stuff. It's things. Certainly not worthy of our worship or attention. Number 3, sports figures and celebrities. Sports figures and celebrities. Now, this is kind of I don't know. People say part of the American dream. I think the American dream's kind of got a little twisted from what it originally was when people kind of coined that phrase. I mean, the American dream originally was, about simply building a house and feeding your family and, having a lifestyle that was good enough to support being happy and safe. Nowadays, it's not really that anymore. It's all about, keeping up with the Kardashians, right? Okay, maybe not. Maybe you don't watch that show, but I don't. I mean, every time it comes on, my blood just boils a little bit. There are other shows that just kind of make me freak out a little bit more, but I don't know. It just drives me kind of crazy. But a lot of people put a lot of attention on these folks who are, celebrities or have celebrity status. So much so that they seem like gods Next one, our careers or accomplishments. This is probably one that hits people a little bit more than the whole celebrity thing, but it's too easy for us to get caught up on, what we have done, especially if, we've had a lot of opportunity to do a lot of good things. We kind of, instead of seeing celebrities as being on that pedestal, we see ourselves as being on that pedestal. I mean, how many people have, literally spent the vast majority of their life and every single waking hour that they should be spending on some other things, and not necessarily, that they have to shun having a career. I mean, you got to live, right? I mean, you got to make money. You need to be able to support the good things or the good works that you do. I mean, Christ, several times in the Scripture, we're told about people who supported his work. These are people who were working jobs, who willingly gave money so that he could go around and do the work that he was doing. And we find people after Christ left who supported the works of Paul and Peter and other disciples in that same way. Paul himself worked as a tent maker with Aquila and Priscilla, and they too gave him, funds to make sure that the preaching of the word was accomplished. So there needs to be a profitable work for us to do in this world, but it's not the whole of our existence. When every waking hour is spent, getting more money, just so we can what? Have more money? So we can have more cars, so we can have more stuff. When does it end? When does it end? It's funny. Anybody ever go to Jimmy John's? You ever go to sub place? Yeah. If you go to Jimmy John's, it's a sub place. It's not expensive, and they have okay subs. You go in there. It is my favorite place as far as decorations go. They have all of these little signs all over the place with all of these cool little sayings. Many of them are very, very biblical, and some of them tell whole big, long stories. But there's one sign I was reading the other day as I was sitting there waiting for my sub. And the thing is, they never keep you waiting more than a minute, so you don't get to read too many signs. So you got to go back multiple times to read the signs. But they have this one sign that says, basically, the gap between enough, okay, or is it, how is it? The gap between more and enough never closes, I think is what it says. In other words, we always want more. You can never go from more to enough. That gap never closes. And how true it is. Many people every day are up early and they're thinking about going to work, and maybe they're hating it. And they get to work and they're maybe hating it, loving it, who knows. But they put in their long hours and they come home and then they think about work some more. And for them it's all about work, career. How do I get ahead? How can I move up? And they really don't give too much time to God or godly things. And they certainly don't think about offering it as, worship to Him. And the funny thing is that I believe that God wants you to even in that place. And we can do this for just about all of this, whether you're in your family or whether you have these possessions or are at the sporting event or at your workplace. All of the things that we've touched on so far are things and places where you could very much worship God. You could give Him your service even while doing those things. I mean, there are people who have turned their workplace into their very own missionary field. People they work with, people they interact with, constantly talking to them. Hey, let me tell you about God. Let me tell you about my Jesus. Let me tell you why it is I'm as happy as, this. Final one. Ourselves. We ourselves can get in our way. Perhaps number one on the list. You've heard the old saying, I'm my own worst enemy. How true it can be. We are often the ones who gets in the way most of our highest pursuits and never seem to get around to seeing past ourselves to the God that made it all, including, us. That's why over and over, the Bible is going to talk about things like, it is not within man who walks to what? Anybody remember? Guide his own footsteps, right? It's not within man who walk to guide his own footsteps. Akin to that idea is pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. You see, sometimes we get so arrogant or proud that we think it's all about the footprints that we make. It's all about the path that we trod. But it's really not. Each and every facet of our life, whether we're in our families, whether it's about our home and the money we have, the sports, the careers, our accomplishments, we can, in those things, offer ourselves in such a manner to God that it gives Him praise and glory. In all of those things. Sometimes opportunity after opportunity presents itself in any one of these arenas, and yet we miss it because we can't see past concern for self, concern for, who we are and what we want. We read a passage this morning as part of the lesson from Philippians, where Paul talks about, don't let your life, and I'm paraphrasing, don't let the things that you would offer in service to God be motivated by selfish ambition. There are people who were doing that. There were people who, for selfish reasons, preached the gospel. Now, they thought it was going to hurt Paul. But it's not going to ever work out for you when that's the case. You can't put self in the lead. Instead, what we need to do is invite God into our lives and ask Him. Ask Him. Show us what in our heart is getting in the way. What in our heart is avoiding us from true and genuine worship. What in our heart is keeping us from, in each and everything we do, in the stuff, in all that we've talked about, giving Him the glory. We invite God in, ask Him, burn away the things that have become my center. Get rid of the things that have distracted me from that true and genuine worship. And when we do that, of course, we ought to be ready for profound change. Because God is pretty good at keeping His promises and answering those prayers. But we better be ready to make the changes that God points out. Well, maybe you're here tonight and you're ready for that change. Maybe you've never obeyed the gospel. Maybe it's time to step out into that aisle and move to the waters of baptism and finally become a child of God. I think for most of us, that's not the case. But you may have struggles and you may need prayers and you may just simply need someone to lean upon and ask for understanding and strength. If you're here tonight and you have any need, I encourage you to come while Ralph comes forward and leads us in song.